First thing my new CEO said to our team was that we needed to stop being prisoners of the past. I'd been with Hartwell Defense Solutions for 18 years. I'd started as a junior systems analyst straight out of Carleton University, back when we were still operating out of a converted warehouse in Kanata. By the time Elaine walked through our doors with her MBA from Rotman and her references from a fintech startup in Waterloo, I was Director of Compliance and the named key personnel on 6 federal contracts with Public Services and Procurement Canada, totaling just over $53 million annually. I remember sitting in that first all-hands meeting and watching her use a laser pointer on a slide that said legacy thinking equals organizational debt. Half the people in the room had security clearances that took longer to obtain than her entire career in defense. Nobody said anything. I looked at my colleague across the table, the man who'd spent 4 years getting our ITAR registration sorted, who knew every clause of the Defense Production Act by memory, and he just gave me that slow blink. The one that means we've seen this before. We had. But this time felt different. Elaine had been brought in by the board after our founder, Mr. Hartwell, retired to his place on Vancouver Island. The board wanted fresh energy. What they got was someone who genuinely believed that government procurement worked like a SaaS sales cycle. Her second week, she called me into her office. It was a glass-walled corner office she'd had refurnished before she even learned where the parking validation stamps were kept. She had a standing desk, one of those white noise machines, and a framed print that said, "Move fast." I'm not making that up. In a defense contracting company with federal security obligations. Move fast. She told me she was restructuring the compliance function. She said the word compliance the way some people say the word legacy, like it was a polite term for something embarrassing. I asked her what she had in mind. She told me she wanted to bring in someone with a more strategic, forward-thinking lens. She said the compliance role needed to be elevated from its current focus on regulatory paperwork. I told her, very calmly, that what she was describing as regulatory paperwork included our obligations under the Security of Canada Information Disclosure Act, our PSPC security clearance maintenance requirements, and our status as the named compliance authority on 6 active federal contracts. She smiled the way people smile when they've already made a decision and are simply performing a conversation. She said she was confident the transition would be smooth. I asked who she had in mind. She paused for just a second. Then she said her nephew, her sister's son, had recently completed his MBA at Queen's and was looking for an opportunity in the defense sector. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even surprise, not really. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of watching someone pick up a live wire because they don't know what a live wire looks like. I said, "All right, I'd like that in writing, please." She blinked. I said, "Any changes to key personnel on our federal contracts require written notification to the contracting authority. I want to make sure we're all documenting this properly." She said she'd have HR follow up with me. I thanked her and went back to my desk. I want to explain something about what key personnel means in federal contracting in Canada, because this is where the story turns, and it's important to understand why. When the federal government awards a contract through PSPC, Public Services and Procurement Canada, for anything involving national security, sensitive information systems, or defense-related services, the proposal names specific individuals as key personnel. These aren't just organizational chart entries. They are named, evaluated, and approved human beings whose qualifications were part of the basis for awarding the contract in the first place. If a key personnel individual leaves, the contractor is obligated to notify the contracting authority in writing. The government then has the right to evaluate whether the replacement meets the original qualification requirements. In some cases, they can suspend contract activity pending that review. In contracts involving security clearances at the secret or top secret level, the clearance transfer and vetting process alone can take anywhere from 8 to 14 months. 6 contracts, $53 million, my name on all of them. I did not share any of this with Elaine. I went home that evening to my house in Stittsville, made dinner, and called my brother-in-law who'd done 30 years with the Royal Canadian Navy and understood federal procurement better than most lawyers I'd met. I told him what had happened. He said, "Does she know about the key personnel clauses?" I said I didn't think she'd read that far into the contracts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to document everything, give appropriate notice, and comply fully with all legal obligations, to the Crown, not to Elaine. He said, "You've always been the careful one." I said, careful had served me well for 18 years. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched the handover process unfold with the particular slow-motion horror of someone who knows exactly what's coming but has no legal obligation to warn anyone. Elaine's nephew, I'll call him by his title, a new compliance lead, arrived on a Monday. He was 26, polite, and entirely well-meaning. I want to be clear about that. He didn't do anything wrong. He was simply the wrong person, placed in the wrong role, at the wrong time, by someone who didn't understand what the role actually required. He had no security clearance, not even enhanced reliability. The clearance application process hadn't even been initiated when he sat down at what had been my desk. I had already submitted my resignation. I gave 4 weeks' notice as required by my employment agreement. I spent those 4 weeks doing 3 things. First, documenting every active file, every obligation, every upcoming deadline, every regulatory requirement. Second, preparing formal written notification to our contracting authority at PSPC as required under each contract's key personnel clause. Third, making sure every single communication went through proper channels with full paper trails. I notified the government. That was not optional. That was a legal obligation. I fulfilled it. What I did not do was advocate on Elaine's behalf. I did not coach the new compliance lead through the clearance process. I did not help interpret the contract clauses to anyone at the company. I answered every question HR asked me. I completed every transition document they required. I did not volunteer information they didn't ask for. There is a difference between sabotage and simply ceasing to carry something that isn't yours to carry anymore. My last day was a Tuesday in late autumn. The maple out front of the Canada office had gone the full orange by then. Someone had put a card on my desk. Most of the senior staff signed it. Elaine did not. I drove home on the 417 and felt something I can only describe as the particular lightness of a decision already made. The call I'd been expecting came 11 days after I left. Not to me, but to a former colleague who reached out to let me know what was happening. Our PSPC contracting officer had sent a formal notice that following receipt of key personnel departure notifications, all 6 contracts were being placed under administrative review pending verification of replacement personnel qualifications and security clearance status. Administrative review meant payments were paused. 6 contracts. $53 million. Payments paused. The company's operating line of credit with BDC, Business Development Bank of Canada, had been structured against projected contract revenue. When the PSPC payments stopped, the credit covenant was tripped within 30 days. My former colleague told me that Elaine had called an emergency board meeting, that she had told them the government review was procedural and would be resolved within weeks. The board had access to legal counsel. Legal counsel had read the contracts. It was not resolved within weeks. The clearance process for the new compliance lead had not yet been initiated because, as it turned out, the required sponsor documentation had been filled out incorrectly on the first attempt, which added time to the process. The contract qualifications review identified several areas where his credentials did not meet the threshold specified in the original proposal. Each of those variances required a separate written response and justification to the contracting authority. Months went by. 2 of the 6 contracts had performance milestone dates during the review period. Missed milestones triggered default clauses. The government exercised its right to terminate for convenience on one contract and began the recompete process on a second. I learned later from someone who'd left the company by then that the board had brought in external counsel to assess whether Elaine had been adequately advised of the key personnel obligations before initiating the transition. The findings of that review I don't know and won't speculate about. What I do know is that Elaine was no longer with the company by the following spring. I was not sitting at home waiting for any of this. I'd taken 3 weeks off after leaving, real time off, which I hadn't had in years. My wife and I drove up to Algonquin in October, stayed at a lodge near Opeongo Lake, watched the geese head south, and I slept 8 hours a night for the first time since I could remember. When I came back, I had 3 conversations in the first 2 weeks. One was with a former PSPC contracting officer who'd moved into private consulting. One was with a mid-sized defense firm in Ottawa that had 2 federal contracts and was actively looking for someone with my specific clearance level and experience. The third was with a legal firm that specialized in government procurement who wanted a compliance advisor on retainer. I took all 3. My clearance transferred. It doesn't expire when you leave a job. It stays with you, attached to your person, valid as long as you maintain it and put it to legitimate use. 18 years of federal clearance, relationships with contracting officers, knowledge of systems that take years to build. None of that walked out the door for Elaine to replace. It walked out the door with me. By the time the spring came and I was settled into my new arrangement, my own company, technically a numbered corporation registered in Ontario, working with 2 clients and billing by the day, I had earned more in 4 months than I had in any full year at Hartwell. Someone from the old company messaged me around that time. Not anyone in management. One of the systems engineers who'd been there almost as long as I had. He said the place felt different now. Quieter in a bad way. He said a lot of the institutional knowledge had walked out with the senior staff over the winter. I said I was sorry to hear it. He said, "Did you know this would happen?" I thought about that for a moment before I answered. I said I knew what the contracts required. I knew what my departure would trigger under the key personnel clauses. I had fulfilled every legal obligation I had to the Crown and to my employer. I had not caused what happened. I had simply stopped preventing it. He said he understood. I think about Elaine sometimes, not with anger. She was not malicious, or at least I don't believe she was. She was someone who looked at a highly specialized, highly regulated, relationship-intensive industry and believed that disruption was a universal solvent. She didn't know what she didn't know, and the people who hired her didn't ask the right questions before handing her the keys. The nephew, for what it's worth, landed on his feet. He moved into a different role at a different company, something in commercial procurement where the regulatory stakes were lower. I genuinely hope he does well. He was put in an impossible position by someone who should have known better. What I've come to believe after 35 years of working in spaces where the government trusts you with things that matter is that institutional knowledge isn't the failure to innovate. It's infrastructure. You can't see it. You can't put it on a slide. You can't replace it with an MBA and a mandate for disruption. It exists in the relationships, the clearances, the years of demonstrated reliability, the quiet understanding between people who've been tested and found trustworthy. When you remove it without understanding what it is, you don't get disruption. You get collapse. The maple outside the Canada office is probably orange again by now. I don't drive past it anymore. I have no reason to. I have my own office now. No standing desk. No white noise machine. Just a window that faces west, a coffee that's always too hot, and work that I understand completely. Because I built every piece of it myself. I still think about that standing desk. That framed print. Move fast. There's something I've learned about consequence, not the dramatic kind you see coming, but the quiet kind that arrives on a Tuesday morning in the form of a government notice. Consequence doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when the gap between what someone believed and what was actually true finally closes. Elaine wasn't a villain. I want to keep saying that because it matters. She was someone who had been rewarded for years for projecting confidence in environments where confidence was enough, where the right language in the right room could carry a decision forward. She walked into Hartwell and she did exactly what had worked before. She just didn't know that in this particular room, the walls were load-bearing. What undid her wasn't malice from anyone. It was the straightforward mechanics of cause and effect. She removed a named person from 6 federal contracts without understanding what named meant in that context. The government then did exactly what the contract said it would do. Payments paused. Covenants tripped. Milestones missed. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because that's what happens when you remove something structural without knowing it was structural. I think about the choices I made in those final weeks. I documented everything. I notified the Crown as required. I answered every question HR put to me completely and honestly. I did not coach anyone I wasn't asked to coach. Those choices weren't clever strategy. They were just the straightforward expression of who I'd been for 18 years. You do what's right. You fulfill your obligations. You don't burn anything down on your way out. But you also don't carry someone else's weight indefinitely when they've made clear they don't want you there. That's the thing about integrity. It's not especially exciting. It doesn't make for a dramatic moment. It's just the slow accumulation of doing the right thing when no one is particularly watching. Until one day, the accumulated weight of it turns out to matter quite a lot, and the intelligence part, the years spent actually understanding the regulations, the clearances, the contract language, the relationships with contracting officers, that wasn't institutional stubbornness. That was the work, the real work, the kind that doesn't show up on a slide about legacy thinking but holds $53 million in place every single year. What I'm most proud of, looking back, isn't the outcome. It's that I didn't panic. When Elaine told me her nephew was taking my role, I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't try to make her understand what she was doing. I just asked for it in writing and went back to my desk. That's steadiness. The ability to absorb a shock and keep moving without losing your bearings. That's something you have to build over time. You can't borrow it. You can't fake it in a meeting. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it yet, the only way to get it is to stay in difficult situations long enough to learn that you can. I have my own office now. The work is good. The coffee is always too hot. That's enough.